Hello, everybody. Welcome. We are very excited to have you here for Bite-Sized Data Fundamentals, Device and Data Management for Hybrid Learning Models. We're going to get started in just a minute. We're going to give folks an opportunity to join the room. But in the meantime, please go into the chat and introduce yourself. Tell us your name, your role, and where you're joining us from today. And we'll get started shortly. All right, well, I think let's get started. If you're just joining us, please introduce yourself in the chat. Tell us your name, your role, and where you're joining us from today. It's always fun to get to know our audience a little bit better. So welcome to Bite-Sized Data Fundamentals, Device and Data Management for Hybrid Learning Models. We're very excited to have you here for another discussion of some big topics in a bite-sized format. Today, I'm just going to introduce and welcome everyone here, and then I'm going to pass it over to our friends at the Center for Democracy and Technology to talk more about data and device management. And then at the end, we will have a little Q&A session. So please, as we are going through in today's presentation, throw your questions and comments in the chat, and we will come back to them at the end of the presentation. I'm Jonathan Barry Wolf. I'm a marketing and communications member of the Project Unicorn team, and I am joined by Hannah Quaydel. I got it wrong already. Quaydella Valley from the. You'll have to pronounce it correctly later. Hannah from senior technologist at CDT, and Cody Vensky, senior counsel for equity and civic technology at CDT as well. So we're very excited to have them both here with us today. Before we get started, a little bit about Project Unicorn. We are an organization dedicated to advancing and implementing data interoperability in K-12 ed tech tools. We work with school district leaders and ed tech vendors to help make data interoperability a possibility. And one of the ways we do that is by coming alongside folks with resources and webinars and technical assistance. And in order to get to experience all of these great resources we provide, please sign the pledge. We have one for school district tech leaders and one for ed tech vendors. And so those links are now in the chat. Sign the pledge, signal to others that you are dedicated to data interoperability, and also have an opportunity to work with us on your interoperability goals. If you're an ed tech vendor in the audience today, please apply for the Project Unicorn Interoperability Certification. This is a free resource offered in partnership with Digital Promise, and it's free to apply for all Project Unicorn signatories. And what you do is you complete a survey, and the interoperability of your ed tech tool is ranked on a scale from 1 to 4. And you receive a badge like you see here on the screen that then you can display, and that is displayed on databases across the internet. In addition, you get to have some one-on-one technical assistance with us to help improve your score. So it's a really excellent free resource you should definitely check out. The link for that will also be in the chat. The Project Unicorn team has also released our second annual school system data survey. We completed the first survey last year, and we did a survey of K-12 school district tech leaders and the interoperability in their school systems. And we produced the State of the Sector report, which indicated some really excellent movements in the way of data interoperability throughout the nation, and also some important challenges and growth points. So it's a really exciting opportunity to get to shape programming around data interoperability. The link for that is also in the chat. And if you are a school district tech leader, if you complete the survey, you also receive a $25 Amazon gift card. So really no downside there. Take the survey, and we look forward to checking out the results. And finally, Project Unicorn is all about data interoperability, so I'll leave you with the definition for data interoperability. It's the seamless, secure, and controlled exchange of data between applications. So without further ado, we're very excited to pass things over to the CDT team. So thanks so much, and let's get started. Thanks.
Awesome. Thank you, Jonathan. As Jonathan mentioned, I'm Hannah Cueto-Lavallee, so he got it pretty close, and in his defense, it's kind of a nightmare of a name. So like I said, I'm not picky about it at all. I'm joining from the Center for Democracy and Technology, which is a nonprofit based out of DC. Cody and I both work for the Equity and Civic Technology team, which started off as the Student Privacy Project, and that's still a huge chunk of the work that we do. And we work on that team making sure that the technology that's used in schools and public agencies is used to help the people who need their help, from those students or folks seeking benefits or whatever it is, rather than harming them. And one way we talk about that is the management and governance of data. This will come as no surprise to anybody on this call, but that job got a whole lot harder during COVID with school closures, with folks going fully remote and now dealing with hybrid models. It's placed quite a burden on school tech folks to try to figure out how to manage both their devices and their data during that process. And it seems like, although we'd love to believe that that would end with the end of COVID, it's looking like there are other events that are going to end up maintaining some amount of remote education pretty helpful. So, of course, we are seeing, frankly, just climate events, students staying home because of extreme weather. And then there's been quite an uptick of cyber attacks against schools, and it doesn't seem like that is likely to taper off anytime soon. So things like DDoS attacks or other ransomware attacks, keeping students away from schools, having this remote learning option is still going to end up being quite helpful to keeping continuing education. So during this webinar, we will be talking about how to manage devices and data when you have this sort of sometimes in, sometimes out model, particularly in contexts where maybe that's a little less predictable than it would be in other circumstances. We're responding to events rather than setting up something that's intended to be this hybrid model. So as we mentioned, there's this real need for flexibility in this context. And one way to do that is to enable device programs. Now, of course, one-to-one device programs can be pretty straightforward in this context, but that's not something every school can offer. And so we're going to be particularly talking about how to manage a stable of devices so that when you have some set of devices and you're loading them out on an as-needed basis. And that can be either because students need them for some period of time to be out of school because of COVID, or if it's you're trying to keep class sizes small and rotate devices between students who are coming in and out of the classroom. So we'll talk in this webinar, we're going to be approaching that through a few different stages. So there's what you do with the device before you lend it out to a student. There's what you do with the devices once they are out in the hands of students and families and how you can support there. And then how to clean and clear devices on their return and make sure that they're ready to go out for the next student who needs them. And I should have mentioned this at the very beginning, but please feel free to drop your questions in the chat as we go if something comes up, and we'll either address them as they go or get back to them at the end. And Cody's also going to be dropping some links into some resources that CDT has put out on these topics. All right, so we'll start off with best practices prior to distributing devices, prior to handing them out to students. So one sort of very fundamental aspect of this is inventorying devices, right? You need to be able to keep track of what you have, who has it, and what they're like, how long you expect it to be out for them. That's important, both for planning purposes, but it's also pretty critical for providing technical support, making sure devices are returned when you expect them to be. This tracking should be done in a privacy preserving way, right? So that means you want to keep track of who has devices and why they have them, but you want to make sure that that information, which can actually be surprisingly sensitive, is protected, right? And that sensitivity can come up both because in the COVID context, the mere fact that somebody has a device might be revealing of some health information, right? They had COVID, or they suspected they had COVID, or they were exposed. It can also end up being revealing of disability information. So if you're loaning out a device and along with it, you have to loan out an accessibility device like an eye tracking software, or something like more physical, like a SIP Puff device, those kinds of things are going to end up being revealing potentially of disability status. So maintaining, doing all of the same good data governance stuff we do with everything, right? Ensuring the people only have access to it who need it, storing data in a secure way, deleting it once you no longer need it, all of that good governance stuff. Another thing to make sure you do before devices go out is keep track of what sorts of maintenance is going to be done on them. That's often going to be things like when they were last wiped and updated, making sure the software is all up to date. That is also helpful when figuring out when devices need to be retired or what needs to be done to them before they go out, right? Again, as part of that, updating devices, particularly security patches. We would all like to believe that all of our devices are going to stay up to date and secure all the time, but it doesn't quite happen. So having them back in your hands is an opportunity to do that and make sure the latest updates and security patches get installed. That's also an opportunity to make sure the device has whatever software it needs on it for the particular student it's being loaned out. Again, whether that's student specific, like disability software like eye tracking, or whether it's class specific. If you're loaning out to a high school student who's in a bio class and they use a molecular modeling program, stealing from my high school bio teacher sister here, making sure that that is on the device, that it runs as expected, all of that good stuff. And then another key privacy component here is making sure to wipe the devices before they go out. This is particularly true if you're doing this sort of rotating device model. So anything on the device might be personal information from the last student who had it. So it's critical to make sure that device gets cleaned and cleared before it goes out again, or frankly, before it's retired and disposed of, to make sure that that data isn't just sitting around for someone to accidentally find. Not all deletion methods are created equal here. So definitely making sure to choose an appropriate deletion method. That's typically going to be something a little bit stronger, like actually reformatting the device or something like that, as opposed to just dragging things into the trash where, they say deleted, but then you can just go ahead and recover them. And then suddenly all of your last month's shopping lists are free for everybody to see. So those are all things to consider before sending the devices out to students and families. There's also plenty to do while the device is in the hands of students. Probably one of the more critical ones is providing technical support, particularly if these are devices that students aren't used to having, or if this is their first time having their own device. They may not have some of the digital literacy skills that we kind of can take for granted for people who've had devices all along. So providing that technical support to make sure that students and families have a place that they can go when they're not sure how to use their device, or if something's gone wrong and they don't know how to fix it. That technical support needs to be, where possible, very accessible to all different types, to all of the students and families lent out, whether that's different languages for parents who don't speak English, having office hours, but also having remote options for folks who are out due to COVID, all of those things to make sure that that technical support is accessible to folks. Another element of that technical support is, if possible, and this is obviously going to depend on the type of devices you're using, not all of them are going to have this, but the ability to remotely secure or wipe devices in the event that they're lost can be an important element to protecting both the students' data, but also the school systems themselves, especially if that device has a portal to get onto school systems more broadly, it can then be used as an attack vector against the overall systems. So having the ability to wipe or to lock down devices remotely can help prevent some of the kinds of cyber attacks that we see against schools. Another pretty critical component of to take care of while devices are lent out is pretty robust communication with students and families who have the devices, particularly with respect to changes in policies and the reason for those. So policies like, we please leave auto updates on, or don't download any software, or even some sort of basic phishing training, those kinds of things, communicating those robustly with families to make sure that they understand why those policies are in place. And, if the policies are changing, the reason behind that policy change. There's definitely a lot of research that suggests that as folks don't understand why securities and policies are in place, they'll try to find workarounds to them. They'll try to go out of their, they'll decide, what, long passwords are inconvenient for me. I don't want to use them. I'm just going to use the same password on all of my devices. That kinds of things, they'll do what feels more convenient if they don't understand the security reason behind the policy. But explaining policies brings compliance up quite a bit. So helping them understand what harm the policy is intending to avoid can help garnering buy-in against these sort of insecure workouts and help folks get really on board with the policies themselves. For the next discussion on what to do when you get the devices back, I'm going to pass it over to my colleague, Cody Venske.
Great, thank you, Hannah. So we're going to shift gears here to the final stage of the device life cycle of how to handle devices once students are done with them and they are being returned back to the school. This is going to mirror a little bit of what Hannah described at the beginning of the life cycle when devices are being handed out. And as Hannah mentioned, before devices are being distributed, it's important that data be cleaned off the device in an effective manner in order to help protect student privacy and safety. When the devices come back, it's important that families are engaged in the process for wiping those devices. CDT research has demonstrated that families and students are eager to help out and learn more about data and technology in schools, but are often an underutilized resource. And that applies here as well. It's important that schools engage with families so that they understand exactly what will happen to their data when the device is returned and how they can back up certain critical data as well. A tip here says, if possible, engage families and students to determine whether or not it would be beneficial for the families and students to hold on to the device for longer periods. Research has shown that when students and families have access to devices, it can help boost key digital literacy and digital skills. And so schools should use this engagement opportunity to help determine whether or not longer lending periods are beneficial for students. Once the devices are returned and once families have been informed and supported in the returning and wiping process, it's important to assess whether or not it's time to retire certain devices. Schools should plan to retire devices as they become obsolete. What we mean by that is that the device can no longer run key software necessary for the students or can no longer receive security updates or patches. This helps preclude situations where devices lent to students and families become a security vulnerability, as well as putting those students who rely on school devices at a disadvantage because they're using suboptimal software. We wanted to share a few resources about the life cycle of devices that CDT has produced to help support school practitioners. First, this material is reflected in a quick two-page piece of guidance that we issued on a quick guide to maintaining and protecting school-issued devices. That guidance also has a companion piece on establishing digital literacy programs to help students and families get online safely. These are meant to be quickly digestible pieces of guidance for folks in the K-12 space with limited resources and critically limited time as well. We've also talked about here the importance of wiping data off devices to help protect student privacy. We have a longer guidance, again, aimed at K-12 practitioners on balancing the scale of student data deletion and retention in education. And finally, Hannah has penned a piece on a security checklist for school-provided technology that may be beneficial for practitioners. You can see our contact information here, and we encourage you to reach out if you have any questions whatsoever. At this point, we will open up the floor for any questions you might have.
Awesome. Yes. Thank you so much, Cody and Hannah. I appreciate your discussion today. Please, if you have questions, put them in the chat. I was hoping maybe you could go back to some of these topics discussed and dig a little bit more into what you were talking about. Specifically, I'd love to hear a little bit more about the updating devices and device security part of our conversation today. So I was wondering if you could kind of go back to that and expound a little bit more on that topic. Yes, I see. A bit of a muting issue here.
Sorry about that.
No
I
worries.
should have known better than to mute myself in these dangerous Zoom times. Yeah, so updating devices is one of those things that feels like it should be pretty straightforward, and it can sometimes be straightforward, but often can actually end up being a little bit more of a complex process depending on the particular kinds of devices that you have. Of course, the most straightforward solution, if your devices allow for it, is typically going to be automatic updates. So that's just, a set it and forget it kind of thing. The device is going to download its own security updates, operating system updates, and download them typically over a night or sometime when the device isn't being used, and install them. The challenge with that comes in two places. The first one is not all devices enable that. That is pretty rapidly changing, fortunately. So we should be getting to the point where that's relatively easy to enable for all devices. We're not quite there yet. The second issue with that is that it can bork software a little bit sometimes. So that's kind of ties into the technical support kind of thing. That also goes into particularly in the school context where each teachers are often finding and using software that works for their particular classes. One of the things that can really help with that is having a centralized model or a centralized way for teachers to get their software onboarded. There's sort of two paths going forward. If you have a teacher using a particular piece of software that doesn't play nice with an update that you install, you kind of have two options, neither of which are great. One, of course, is sorry, you don't get to use that software while you're on this particular device. And so whether that means that the teacher has to find alternative things for that student to do or hold off on using that software until a student is back into like a school computer lab or something. That's one approach there. The other one, of course, is delaying the update on the device. That's obviously not ideal for security reasons. It may be something that you can do for a while if you look at a set of updates that the device is trying to install and none of them are particularly security relevant. Most device manufacturers will label security updates as such. So if you see that the updates are just usability updates or, allowing you to display time in 24 hours instead of just 12, like those are things that you can hold off on. But that does add the administrative burden of keeping track of what these updates are and probably will eventually hit a security update and put you in that situation where you have to update the device and then have to figure out some kind of workaround for the software. So yeah, updating is like one of those things where it's like, ideally it's pretty straightforward. Having teachers have sort of a centralized set of what all they're using can be really helpful in this, just in making sure it's compatible. And if you have the resources, giving teachers other alternatives for software. So if they found something that's really useful to them, but it's not being maintained anymore, or it's kind of a bit of a security mess, then knowing that what they're using can sometimes put you in a position of offering alternatives to see if something a little more manageable on your end can also meet that teacher's needs. Awesome. And see, there are also some questions in the chat.
I can hop in here, Hannah, with a few of the questions. Chris Mogia, sorry, Chris, if I mispronounced your last name. I had a couple of great questions. One was, are we building these resources into a binder that we can distribute to practitioners? We actually had that revelation recently as well, that we need to compile them together in a way that is centralized for folks to come back to. Because although we try to make many of these resources accessible for folks in the K-12 space, it'd still be good to have them all in one location for practitioners to come together. So it's good to know that that's something that would be useful. As to your second question, as for a catalog of devices that list their security levels, I'm not aware of any particular resource that does that. There are some out there that measure privacy protections and privacy policies. That's always an interesting endeavor to assign ratings to either privacy or security, because that's, of course, a complex field and one that is extremely circumstance specific. Some practitioners that we work with often use the mantra of don't let perfect be the enemy of good when it comes to privacy and security, because having the latest and greatest in NIST standards or what have you isn't as important as sometimes taking those first basic steps that Hannah has touched on, such as ensuring that security patches are updated and that your user base is implementing best practices like secure passwords. So although those resources might be useful because there are variations, like it can be complex, and often those basic first steps are just as critical as the underlying, say, encryption standard of a particular app.
Yeah, and as far as the question about whether CDT has resources for policy templates, that's not something that we have, and I'm not aware of any resource sites off the top of my head, but that's certainly something we can take a look for and follow up with the Project Unicorn folks if we find anything particularly good.
I will add two brief addenda to Hannah's comment. The data deletion brief that Hannah shared in the comments earlier does include a few resources for K-12 folks, including documentation that you can take and implement in your school. I'm a former teacher, and our project director, Elizabeth Laird, is a former K-12 state education agency employee. So we're all very dedicated to ensuring that these resources that we provide are something that practitioners can implement. Another great resource is the Student Privacy Policy Office of the Department of Education. I just dropped their website in the chat here, and they do have some draft templates for both policies and other actionable guidance on their website. And if you're not familiar with it, it's a great resource to peruse.
Thank you, Cody. I totally forgot about the resources in the deletion brief. What is in there is a template for keeping track of what data has been deleted and when and how, which could definitely be repurposed into something you use for managing devices. There's also in there a kickoff letter for doing a data inventory. I think that is more in the vein of what we're talking about with updates about keeping track of what all teachers are using in this space. So that would be very helpful in instituting that. There's not a device use policy in there, but definitely some resources to be starting with. I know we're almost at time. Any final questions, or the Project Unicorn folks have some wrap up? So
yeah, so we will be following up after this call with a link to the recording, as well as a list of all the resources and links that were shared in the chat. So be sure to look out for that email so you can get access to all of the things we shared out today. Thank you all so much for being here. Thank you to the CDT folks for sharing with us today. Let's keep the conversation going. We have Twitter links, Twitter handles here on the slide. Please reach out to us with any further questions or thoughts, we're always excited to chat with you and keep these conversations happening. We got a bunch more webinars in the pipeline. Tomorrow at 2 p.m. we have the next in our Great Data States webinar series. We're headed virtually on a trip to South Carolina to hear how the South Carolina Department of Education utilized multiple data standards to implement data interoperability in their school systems. Really excited for that one. Please join us. The link to register is in the chat for that one. We have an incredible conversation coming up around the topic of, is data neutral? Critical questions about bias and equity on March 29th at 2 p.m. Link to register to that one is also in the chat. The prep calls for this have been amazing. So much interesting content. And so very excited for this webinar to come out and to hear the full thing. So be sure to join us for that one. And finally, after South Carolina, we'll also be taking another trip over to North Dakota to hear about the North Dakota Department of Public Instruction and how they've worked with data interoperability as well. We are so excited that you joined us, and we hope that you will join us for the next one. Thank you to all participants and speakers, and we will see you at the next webinar. Thanks so much. Have a great one.
Thanks so much, folks.